And perhaps let me move on to say that, the mainstream feminist movement has made serious mistakes. I often point out that when I wrote a book that was published in 1981 called Women, Race, and Class, everybody started referring to me as a feminist. And my response was, I'm not a feminist. I'm a Black revolutionary. Because I didn't see how the two had anything to do with each other.
I can still remember the first time I really interacted with the idea of feminism. It was probably about 15 years or so ago, and like many of my late night thoughts back then, it started with scrolling through Tumblr. I came across a post talking about a woman's right to choose, and it hit me. It was an election year, so of course, abortion was on everyone's mind. Now, this wasn't some overnight awakening. I didn't suddenly flip from anti choice to feminist icon. I wasn't anti abortion or anything. I just hadn't ever really thought deeply about it before. See, I grew up in an evangelical household. That is a conversation for a whole nother day. And I'm a Black girl from Compton who grew up in the 90s, right in the thick of purity culture, misogyny, and a society that didn't think twice about who got to actually have a voice. Feminism wasn't exactly a part of the curriculum at home, at school, or anywhere. Outside of a brief mention during the women's suffrage unit, it just wasn't talked about. And yet, even back then, I knew my beliefs didn't line up with what my church or my family preached. What I didn't know was that those quiet internal moments that I was having were actually kind of radical. The internet changed that. Suddenly, I had access to voices that I had never heard before. And let's be real, ask 5 different people what feminism means, and you'll probably get 5 wildly different answers. Some people still think it means hating men and not shaving your armpits. And that's the kind of messaging that I grew up with. Nobody told me any differently, especially not the Black women in my community. Feminism was either ignored or talked about with suspicion, but definitely not celebrated. So when I stumbled on feminist spaces online, I didn't just dip my toes in. I kind of swan dived right down into the rabbit hole. Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde. I devoured it all, and pretty quickly I noticed something odd. A lot of what I was reading didn't quite speak to women like me. So enter Angela Davis, and it all started to kind of click. The feminism that I was encountering, mainstream feminism, had some major blind spots. It wasn't built with all of us in mind. Since then, it's been a journey of learning, unlearning, and relearning what it really means to be a feminist. But with every step forward, new questions would pop up. Why don't more women of color call themselves feminists? Why is the movement still so divided? Maybe because some of us weren't ever really invited in, or maybe we were remembered only when it was convenient. If we're going to talk about feminism, and I mean really talk about it, we've got to look at where it started, what it's gotten wrong, and how we might be able to build something better. Because even now, with all the progress that we've made and the backsliding that's currently happening, feminism still has a lot of growing up to do. Now that I've said feminism so many times that it doesn't sound like a real word, let's take a step back and talk about what it actually is and what it historically hasn't been. At its core, feminism is a social, political, and ideological movement that fights for gender equality, especially when it comes to women's rights and breaking down the systems that keep gender based oppression alive and well. It's about equal pay, reproductive rights, freedom from violence, and the right to show up in the world however you are. Over time, feminism has evolved in ways, each responding to the world around it. What people were fighting for, what needed changing, and what was missing from the conversation. Breaking it down into these waves makes it easier to see what's shifted and who's been centered or erased along the way. So let's start at the very beginning. First wave of feminism in the US kicked off in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. Picture a room full of bold women led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, standing up and saying, hey, what if we had the right to vote? Radical for the time, and also not the full story. In the years after the Civil War, activists like Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth pushed for women to be included in the constitutional amendments being drafted for formerly enslaved people. But even within this movement of progress, deep cracks were starting to show. The 14th Amendment in 1868 promised equal protection under the law, but was the first time the Constitution used the word male, which explicitly left women out. 2 years later, the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to Black men, but again said nothing about sex. Women of all races were being left out in the cold. So this caused a split in the movement. On one side, the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Stanton and Anthony, opposed the 15th Amendment because it didn't include women. On the other, the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone, took a we'll get our turn next approach and supported the amendment anyway. But this wasn't just about strategy, and it got racial fast. Some white feminists were furious that Black men got the right to vote before they did. And instead of advocating for justice for everyone, they started leaning into classist and racist rhetoric. They argued that educated white women deserve the vote more than ignorant Black men, turning the conversation from universal rights into a competition. That move pushed Black women to the margins again. Activists like Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and later Ida B. Wells were doing double duty. They were fighting both for racial justice, but also for gender equality, but then they were often shut out of these white led organizations. Stanton, for example, wrote scathing articles in her paper, The Revolution, warning that men like Patrick and Sando and Hans and Young, yep, that's an actual quote, would be allowed to vote while refined, educated women would not. It was classist, it was racist, and it became the blueprint for how the mainstream movement would handle race badly. Even Susan B. Anthony, once close with Frederick Douglass, chose to court Southern white women, some of who were very open about supporting white supremacy, because she thought it would help her cause. She argued that white women's votes could help balance out Black political power. Needless to say, Black feminists weren't here for that. Despite this exclusion, Black women kept fighting. When white suffragists tried to push them to the back, literally and figuratively, leaders like Ida B. Wells pushed right back. In 1913, she famously refused to march at the back of a segregated suffragist parade in DC. Her defiance became a symbol of the Black feminist resistance, visible, vocal, and completely unwilling to be erased. So when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, it was celebrated as a victory, but only for some. While white women finally got the right to vote, many Black women in the South still couldn't, thanks to Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and outright violence. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, over 4 decades later, that many of those barriers were even partially dismantled. So, yeah, the first wave of feminism got some things right, but left a lot of women behind. And unfortunately, that pattern didn't stop there. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the world was in the middle of a massive shakeup. You had the civil rights movement, anti war protests, the sexual revolution. People were asking big, scary questions about power, identity, freedom, and justice. And out of that cultural wildfire came the second wave of feminism. It wasn't just about voting anymore. Now the focus was broader: jobs, marriage, sexuality, motherhood, and basically all the ways women were expected to smile, nod, and keep quiet. But here's the thing: even as the movement expanded, it kept repeating an old mistake, centering the voices of, and needs of white middle class women and leaving the rest of us out in the cold. Let's talk about Betty Friedan for a second. Her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, is widely credited with kicking off the second wave of feminism. In it, she talks about the problem that has no name. This is the emptiness that so many suburban housewives felt, stuck in domestic routines with no sense of purpose beyond being a wife and mother. And you know what? Those concerns were real. That feeling of being boxed in, invisible, was absolutely worth naming and challenging. But the story Friedan told left a lot of people out. Her version of womanhood assumed you had the luxury of being a full time homemaker in the first place. For a lot of Black immigrant and working class women, that just wasn't the case. We'd already been working, cleaning houses, nursing babies that weren't ours, cooking meals for other families, long before it became a feminist issue. The oppression didn't start in the kitchen. It was already baked into the economy, the legal system, the hospital, the police station. The version of feminism being offered just didn't match the reality that Black women at the time were living. Even organizations like the National Organization for Women, founded in 1966, focused mostly on things like workplace discrimination, abortion rights, and climbing the corporate ladder. All important, but again, who had access to those ladders in the first place? For Black women especially, the 60s brought another round of that old question: which fight are you fighting? Mainstream feminism often treated racism like a side quest. Meanwhile, Black liberation movements, though powerful, were often led by men and built around patriarchy. That meant Black women were getting tugged in two different directions, constantly being asked to choose. Are you here for the movement or are you here for women? Spoiler alert, they were here for both and always have been. But the choice itself was a trap. It left so many Black women without a true home in either movement, leading to the same conclusion we'd come to before: if the space doesn't exist, we'll build it ourselves. Once again, Black women carved out their own path. Groups like the Combahee River Collective emerged in the 1970s and laid it all out. The oppression we face isn't one dimensional. It's not just about being Black or being a woman or being working class or queer. It's about all of it, layered, tangled, and messy. In 1989, legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw gave that reality a name: intersectionality. She gave us language for something many of us had already lived. Intersectionality wasn't just an academic theory, it was a mirror. It showed us how the systems around us don't separate race from gender from class. They pile on, and we carry all of it, all at once. But that clearly didn't magically fix things. In fact, some second wave feminists pushed policies that made things worse for the very people that they claimed to stand for. Take the myth of the welfare queen, for example. It was a racist, classist trope used to criminalize Black single mothers, especially during the rise of President Reagan. Some feminists, in their push for women's independence, backed welfare reform policies that ended up reinforcing that myth. The result was harsher rules and less support for low income families, all under the banner of empowerment. Or look at how domestic violence was handled. Many feminist organizations advocated for tougher laws to protect women, and in theory, this sounds great. But those laws often came with increased policing and mandatory minimum sentences, disproportionately affecting Black communities. Once again, state violence was allowed to masquerade as protection. And then there was the movement's complicated relationship with queerness. Lesbian women were part of the feminist fight from day one, but you wouldn't always know it from the way that they were treated. In 1970, Betty Friedan, yes, her again, referred to lesbians in the movement as the Lavender Menace, worried they make feminism look bad. So, what did the lesbians do? They showed up at the Second Congress to unite women wearing shirts that proudly said Lavender Menace and demanded their place at the table. Groups like Radical Lesbians and the Furies Collective formed in response. They didn't just advocate for inclusion, they critiqued the whole structure of heteronormativity in feminism. Some even embraced lesbian separatism, asking what it would look like to reject men entirely, even in their private lives. They weren't trying to be palatable, they were trying to be free. Throughout the second wave, there was this constant hum in the background: be respectable, be polished, be professional. It's how you get heard, it's how you stay safe. For Black women, that pressure was even more intense. Respectability politics, originally developed as a survival strategy, told us that we had to speak proper, dress modestly, and never, ever make anybody uncomfortable. Our acceptance depended on how well we could code switch, shrink ourselves, and smooth out our rough edges. Feminist spaces mirrored this. If you were poor, queer, loud, visibly angry, or didn't fit into a white middle class idea of femininity, you were seen as a problem or you were just treated as invisible altogether. It wasn't enough to have something to say, you had to say it the right way. But all that performance comes with a cost. Research shows that constantly monitoring your behavior to avoid discrimination triggers the body's stress response. Over time, that kind of vigilance can wreck your mental and physical health. It's exhausting and it's often invisible. And yet, for many Black women, especially those connected to the church, that tightrope was the only path available. The church was both a sanctuary and a source of gendered control. You could speak your truth, just don't rock the boat too much. By the end of the second wave, something started to shift. More and more women, especially Black women, queer women, and sex workers, were saying enough. Enough of being quiet, enough of playing nice, enough of pretending that shaving your legs make you more liberated than someone who doesn't. Feminism was changing again. It was getting louder, messier, more rebellious. And just around the corner, a new generation was ready to take the mic. By the late 1980s, feminism had notched some big wins: Roe versus Wade, Title IX, anti discrimination laws. It had changed the legal landscape in huge ways. But despite all that progress, something still wasn't clicking. The culture, still deeply sexist, and feminism, it was getting a bad rap. You started seeing feminists in the media being portrayed as angry man haters who hated fun and fashion and, God forbid, femininity. It was all shoulder pads and scowls. And honestly, some of that image stuck, especially with younger women. They were starting to feel disconnected from the movement, even though they were living in the very world that earlier feminists had helped create. So, what happens when you've grown up with more rights but still feel boxed in? You start tearing the whole thing down and rebuilding it in your own image. Enter third wave feminism. This wave wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't playing by anyone's rules, not even feminism. It was loud, contradictory, unapologetic. It was born out of backlash and boredom, and it sounded like a distorted guitar and read like a Xerox zine. You had Riot Girl, an underground punk feminist movement that exploded in the early 90s. These women weren't interested in perfect prose or polite protests. They were making messy art, screaming into microphones, writing manifestos about sex, abuse, body image, and power. It was raw, it was DIY, and it was liberation on their own terms. Third wave feminists weren't here to reject pop culture, they were ready to remix it. They took the tools of the mainstream and made them feminist. Suddenly, you had feminism in music videos, on magazine covers, and sitcoms. It was weird and cool to see feminism showing up in places where it used to be otherwise ignored. One of the big shifts in this era was the move toward individualism. Second wave feminism had been about changing the system. Third wave feminism said, cool, but like also I want to wear heels and talk about orgasms. It wasn't about fitting into one mold. You could be a stay at home mom or a CEO. You could wear fishnets or you could wear khakis. There was no one way to be a feminist anymore. Choice became the name of the game. And honestly, it was kind of freeing. For some people, feminism started to feel more accessible, more personalized, but of course, that came with a catch. If feminism becomes just about individual empowerment, what you wear, who you sleep with, and how you work, it can lose its teeth. It starts to sound more like a vibe than a movement because not every choice happens on a level playing field. Not every freedom is actually free when you're poor, marginalized, or navigating systems that are designed to trap you. As feminism went mainstream, it started getting a corporate makeover. Suddenly, empowerment was a brand. You could buy it on a t-shirt, see it on a billboard, or hear it in a TED talk. There were campaigns that told us to lean in, to speak louder in meetings, to break the glass ceiling. And those messages weren't inherently bad, but they mostly worked for a very specific group of women: white, educated, middle class, and already on the path to power. Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In became the poster child for this kind of feminism. It encouraged women to climb the corporate ladder, to hustle harder, to push through the noise. But it didn't do much to question why the ladder was so hard to reach for some of us in the first place. It assumes we all have the same tools, time, and safety nets. This was feminism for the conference room, not the classroom, not the kitchen, not the streets. Even as third wave feminism tried to be more inclusive, it often defaulted to the same old perspective: white, cisgender, able bodied, middle class women. Intersectionality became a buzzword in this era, finally getting the attention it deserved. But saying the word and doing the work are two very different things. Black feminists like Bell Hooks and Kimberly Crenshaw kept calling out how the movement was still leaving people behind, even when it claimed to be for everyone. And once again, those doing the most radical on the ground works were often left out of the spotlight. One of the loudest parts of the third wave feminist movement was a celebration of sex positivity. Women were reclaiming their bodies, their desires, and their right to express themselves however they wanted without judgment. And that was huge. But as we get deeper into the 2010s and the Me Too movement began, things got more complicated. Because what happens when the lines between choice and coercion start to blur? What about the women who said yes because they were afraid to say no? What about those who stayed silent to keep their jobs, their reputations, or their safety? The movement had to pause and ask, is being empowered really the same as being free? Then came the real game changer, the internet. Blogs, forums, early social media blew the gates wide open. For the first time, people who had been shut out of traditional feminist spaces could build their own. Marginalized voices, queer folks, disabled folks, people of color started carving out digital homes where they could speak freely, connect, and organize. There were so many wins, new voices, global connections, real time mobilizing, but of course, the internet comes with its own issues. With visibility comes backlash. Call out culture took root. The nuance sometimes got flattened into slogans. Performative activism, saying the right thing for clout instead of change, started to rise. And without a clear structure or shared agenda, the movement got fragmented. Loud, yes, but sometimes also lost. Third wave feminism reshaped the public conversation in incredible ways. It pushed for more inclusivity. It celebrated queerness, gender fluidity, and different ways of being. It reminded us that feminism didn't have to look one particular way, but it also drifted into a kind of choose your own adventure feminism. And while that flexibility was empowering for some, it sometimes meant skipping over the harder questions, like how capitalism, racism, and carceral systems still shaped our choices. It lifted up the girl boss, but forgot about the woman cleaning her office. It celebrated visibility, but didn't always deliver material change. And that's where things start to shift again. Because while third wave feminism was building a playlist, the next wave was starting to build a protest. If the third wave cracked the door open, the fourth wave kicked it off the hinges with a tweet. Welcome to the 2010s, where feminism went viral. Suddenly, you didn't have to read a book or attend a rally to hear someone's story. You could open your phone and scroll through hundreds of them. And in a world where so much harm had been hidden, dismissed, or denied, that visibility started to feel like a revolution. But it also came with its own growing pains. Because when everyone has a platform, it gets real loud real fast, and not all noise brings clarity. Still, if you had to sum up this wave in one phrase, it might be we aren't going to be quiet about it anymore. Fourth wave feminism is deeply online. Unlike previous movements that lived in protests, courtrooms, or classrooms, this one lives on timelines, in hashtags, and under comment threads. Movements like Me Too, Yes All Women, and Time's Up didn't just make headlines, they flooded them. Survivors, many of them who had never been believed or heard, can now tell their stories on their own terms. And they were believed, or at least more believed than they had been previously. For many of us, this felt seismic. The scale of harm was finally being named out loud and in public. But that kind of raw exposure also made people targets. The more visible you were, the more vulnerable you became. And guess who bore the brunt of the backlash? Black women, Indigenous women, trans folks, disabled folks, sex workers, the same people who had been doing the work all along. The internet made us visible, but it didn't always make us feel safe. As feminism became trendy, again, it started showing up everywhere in ad campaigns, fashion lines, TED Talks, even Super Bowl commercials. The future is female was plastered on $300 t shirts. Feminism was no longer a dirty word, now it was an aesthetic. And that's complicated. On one hand, mainstream acceptance can feel like progress. On the other, it can sand down the radical edges. When empowerment gets packaged and sold, it stops being about justice and starts to be about branding. Suddenly, the version of feminism that got the spotlight was clean, palatable, and professional. It wore blazers, it had curated Instagram feeds, it wrote books and got invited to panels. Meanwhile, the messy, unfiltered, working class, real parts of the movement still left on red. One of the loudest, rawest, and most urgent battlefields of the fourth wave was sex work. On paper, this wave was more inclusive than any before, but in practice, that line kept moving. While some feminists, especially younger, queer, or trans activists, pushed for sex workers' rights, others clung to the idea that all sex work is inherently violent or degrading. It became a dividing line: abolition versus decriminalization. But here's the lived reality. For many sex workers, especially Black, brown, queer, and trans folks, criminalization doesn't save them. It makes their lives more dangerous. It puts them at greater risk of violence, not from clients, but from police. Take Sesta Fosta, a law passed in 2018 that was supposed to fight sex trafficking. In reality, it shut down websites that sex workers use to advertise and screen clients safely. The result is that people were pushed offline and into riskier situations. More violence, not less. And still, so many mainstream feminist organizations were silent about it. If feminism can't stand up for the people that are most criminalized, most stigmatized, and most at risk, what are we even doing? Intersectionality finally became mainstream during this wave, and thank God for that. But let's be real, a lot of people were saying the word without doing the work. In theory, this was the most inclusive wave yet, but when you looked closely, the same dynamics were playing out. Black and Indigenous women were still underrepresented, trans people still debated instead of heard, and disabled activists were still treated like an afterthought. It's not enough to name everyone in your mission statement. Inclusion that's only performative is just another form of exclusion with better lighting. One of the biggest cracks in this wave is how it handles state violence. Feminism has always fought back against male violence, but what happens when the abuser wears a badge? For many feminists, especially white institutional ones, calling the police still feels like the go to response to harm. But for sex workers, undocumented folks, Black communities, and trans people, the police aren't the solution. Oftentimes, they are the threat. Fourth wave feminism hasn't fully figured out how to hold to that contradiction. A lot of people still believe that punishment equals justice, that prison time equals healing. But carceral feminism, feminism that relies on the criminal justice system to fix everything, often does more harm than good, especially to those already under its thumb. Justice can't only look like someone going to jail. Sometimes it needs to look like someone getting housing or therapy or safety or community. Here's another twist. The fourth wave rose alongside a culture obsessed with individualism, self care, self branding, self empowerment. And yes, boundaries and bubble baths are super important. I partake. But somewhere along the way, feminism became more about you than about us. Instead of organizing for universal health care or childcare or a living wage, a lot of the conversation turned inward. It became about negotiating your salary, loving your body, getting that promotion. And while those things absolutely matter, they don't dismantle the systems making life hard in the first place. Visibility is not the same as liberation. Having a voice is not the same thing as having power. So, what were some of the wins for fourth wave feminism? It brought invisible harm into the light. It gave language and solidarity to survivors. It amplified more diverse voices than ever before. And it opened up space for queer, trans, and sex worker inclusion, at least in theory. But some of the hard truths are it still rewards respectability and polish. It often confuses virality with actual change. It talks about inclusion but struggles to practice it. And it hasn't fully let go of systems that were never meant to keep us safe in the first place. So, what now? Fourth wave feminism is still unfolding. It's messy and beautiful and flawed. It's taught us that calling something out is only the beginning, that hashtags are powerful, but they're not enough, that real liberation doesn't fit into a tweet. If this wave is going to mean something, it can't just stop at visibility. It has to move toward transformation, toward material change, toward something rooted not in branding or performance, but in care, in solidarity, and in action. Feminism has never been a straight line. It's more like a winding, tangled path full of dead ends, U turns, breakthroughs, and breakdowns. From the suffragettes to Seneca Falls to the hashtags on your feed, feminism has always been about trying to name and fight injustice, even when it doesn't always get it right. And if we've learned anything from all these waves, it's this: feminism is not just one thing. It's not one story, one voice, one type of woman. It's a terrain of struggle, argument, dreaming, and rebuilding. And it's always been shaped by the forces around it: race, class, colonialism, capitalism, war, technology, and culture. But that constant evolution has also revealed some deep contradictions that we can't ignore. A feminism that claims to stand for liberation but still clings to police, prisons, and punishment. A feminism that celebrates empowerment but sells it in a tote bag. A feminism that says intersectional but keeps censoring witnesses and respectability. A feminism that upholds bodily autonomy but forgets sex workers, trans people, and disabled folks when it actually counts. If we're going to move forward, we have to stop mistaking inclusion for liberation. It's not enough to add marginalized folks to a broken system and call it progress. That's not freedom, it's rebranding. The future of feminism doesn't lie in being more palatable, more professional, or more polished. It lies in being more radical, more honest, more grounded in care, not control. We need a feminism that is anti capitalist because economic violence is gendered violence. Is abolitionist because we know prisons and policing don't make us safe, they only uphold power. Is sex worker inclusive because bodily autonomy doesn't stop when money changes hands. And let's go of respectability because being good never saved us, it just made us easier to ignore. This next wave, whatever we call it, has to be about building new systems, not just getting access to old ones. It has to be about housing, healthcare, food, safety, education, about rest, about care, about imagining lives where we are more than our survival. We've been seen, now we have to be held. It's not enough to be visible if we're still unsafe. It's not enough to be included if we're still exploited. Feminism can't just live on Instagram. It has to live in mutual aid networks, in community care, in strikes and solidarity and softness. As Angela Davis said, feminism involves so much more than gender equality. It involves a consciousness of capitalism, of racism, of colonialism and post colonialism and ability, and more genders than we can even imagine. That's the kind of feminism that I want to be a part of. One that's not trying to be perfect, but is willing to be brave. One that's not afraid to disrupt. One that reaches for liberation, not just visibility. Because at the end of the day, respectability has never saved us. It just made the cage a little more comfortable. Our feminism has to be dangerous, disruptive, and above all, liberatory.
I mean, one thing, this is something that's been on my mind lately and it's been disturbing me, is that if feminism is all things to all people, then what is it? I mean, how do we locate it as a radical political movement in our lives if everybody just makes of it, which doesn't mean that we should demonize, but we do have to be clear about what are the boundaries. That what is the line that you cross that you can in fact say I'm a feminist. Like for me, my students will say, well, I'm anti-abortion, but I'm a feminist. And I'll say, but that is impossible because you can say I would never choose to have an abortion because I don't support that for myself. But there is no one who's genuinely a feminist who doesn't support reproductive rights for women.